Hey, good morning, object-oriented students. I haven't heard from me um, verbally in a while. I just wanted to say a couple things about Chapter 13 because Chapter 13 also includes a throwback to Chapter 5. I wanted to explain why that is. So, Chapter 13 is about building GUIs. We're going to build GUIs in code. Usually your IDE will have something that allows you to drag and drop and lay out a GUI. You can get some really horrendous GUIs this way. So, for example, Alan Cooper was the lead engineer, creator of Visual Basic. So back in the 1990s, when people started making graphical user interfaces for Windows, and they had absolutely no training on how to do that, there were some hideous, hideous pieces of business software written. Cooper felt so ashamed or abashed about this that he wrote a book on interaction design called About Face. It's now in its fourth edition. I'm sorry, now in its fourth edition, and it is not the only book out there on interaction design, but certainly one of the go-tos that should be considered. So just with keeping that in mind. Wrong PowerPoint. There we go. So, moving along. I have no idea why that did that. Well, that's interesting. Let's try reopening the file. File, open. Let's try closing the file and reopening the file. And moving things back into place. Okay, so this chapter is about constructing GUIs and about using code, but to do so, however, the project that you're going to do is going to be working with an image. It's not really so much an image editor, but it's something that will open up image files and transform them. So it won't let you do painting like paint.net or Photoshop, but it is like applying Photoshop filters. So just a little bit about GUIs. The way the code was written was horrendous in the early days of Java. So they have a bunch of different objects that you can read about in the chapter, and there's different components that are actually the things that you're accustomed to working with, buttons, menus, sliders. And then there are also these other objects that control how they get put together. And then the big thing is, how do you react to the events? Because up until now, you run a program and it goes through and then it ends. But anything that's being done inside of a GUI has to look for things like, has the mouse moved? Have they clicked the right button, the left button, the scroll wheel? Have they clicked on an icon, or have they clicked on a menu item? And that event-driven programming model is very different, and probably is what feels very different to you from, like, it's very far removed from what we do in 103, 105, and even in this course, from the way you interact with computers, because there's so many layers of objects between what has to happen for the OS to do what it needs to do, the operating system to do what it needs to do, and for the application to work. In the early days, there was this thing called the Abstract Windowing Toolkit. Now you might recognize AWT because we were using that with like color.awt, or in the very first thing with the pictures, if you looked at Square or the canvas, you were seeing the AWT, the Abstract Windowing Toolkit. That was deemed not to be enough, and so Sun Microsystems, which were the creators of Java before they got acquired by Oracle, introduced a new library called Swing, built on top of AWT. They cleaned up some pieces and also extended it because they realized they made it difficult for people to write GUIs. So with all of that, everything that you see inside of your objects, inside of a graphical interface in Java, it exists inside of a frame. So that includes things like the title bar, the menu bar, where the content lives. The code is somewhat chunky. There's a lot of code to be done. So I'm going to let you go through the project, through the presentation and through the chapter and read some things. But I just want to highlight, like, you have to actually add everything. To make a menu bar, you make a menu bar object, then you make a menu item, then you make an item for the menu item. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You make a menu bar object, then you make a menu object, which is one of the elements on the menu bar. Then you make a menu item, which is one of the objects on the menu, which is one of the objects on the menu bar. And there's a lot of code that goes into making that. We have to respond to events. The old way of event handling involved setting up event listeners, and those event listeners involved creating objects that were then attached to the different parts of the GUI. Now, the thing is, the syntax for creating these objects were really, really cumbersome, really, really convoluted. The chapter talks about it because if you are inheriting a Java project, you may see this older way of doing things. The thing that forces us to go back to chapter 5 is that lambdas actually make this code a lot easier. So, as you read through, keep in mind that some of the stuff you're going to be looking at is like, why in the world is there all of this code? Oh my goodness. And then, what is this easier way, but it has a completely different syntax? It's because the new lambda object, which is basically putting a function in place. Whoops, my screen just got taken over by Unity. Which is basically putting a function in place. The new Lambda object, which is putting function right in the code, allows the listener to work. So I'm going to wrap this here because I have to go to a webinar, and hopefully if you have questions, you'll tap me online. Talk to you later.